In a land scorched by the relentless sun, where crops withered and rivers dried, a man named Isaac stood at a crossroads. The earth beneath his feet, once fertile, now cracked in despair. The winds carried whispers of famine, a hunger that gnawed at both the land and the hearts of the people. Isaac, son of the great Abraham, faced a decision that would shape the future of nations. Would he flee to Egypt, the land of abundance, or would he stay in a foreign land, trusting in the unseen promises of God? Isaac could feel the weight of his ancestors upon him. Years before, his father Abraham had faced a similar drought, a test of faith that had pushed him toward Egypt. Now, Isaac found himself in the same position, but with a divine voice guiding him in a different direction. One evening, as the sky glowed with the fading light of the sun, the Lord appeared to Isaac. It wasn't the first time he had heard the voice of God, but the moment was no less profound. "Do not go down to Egypt," God commanded, his voice resonating with authority. "Stay in this land, the land I will show you, and I will be with you." The path ahead seemed uncertain. Isaac knew Egypt held food, water, and safety, everything a man would need in times of famine. Yet here was God, telling him to remain in a land that offered none of these things. Isaac's heart stirred with a mix of uncertainty and awe. Egypt was the obvious solution, the rational choice, but God's command carried the weight of a promise that could change everything. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, God spoke again, reminding Isaac of the covenant he had made with Abraham. "I will give you all these lands," God said, as Isaac gazed at the barren soil beneath him. "To you and your descendants, I will fulfill the promise I swore to your father. Your offspring will be as numerous as the stars." Isaac looked up, seeing the vast, glittering expanse above him. Could it be? Could his lineage be that countless? It was a vision too great for his human mind to fully grasp, but the voice of God filled his heart with hope. God had been faithful to his father Abraham. There was no reason to doubt now. "All the nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed," God continued, "because your father Abraham obeyed me and kept my commands." The promise was immense: land, descendants, and a blessing that would ripple through all of history. But with the promise came a challenge. Isaac had to obey, and so Isaac chose to trust in the unseen. He would not flee to Egypt. He would stay in Gerar, a land ruled by King Abimelech, the ruler of the Philistines. It was not an easy choice. He knew the risks of staying in foreign territory, especially as a man blessed by God. But Isaac had learned from his father that God's promises were never void, even in the face of impossible circumstances. And so, in the dry and barren land, Isaac stayed, holding fast to the God of his father, Abraham, the God who promised life, even in the midst of famine. Isaac dwelled in the land of Gerar, under the watchful eyes of its people and their ruler. Isaac harbored a deep fear. As the days passed, the burden of his anxiety grew, centered not around the famine or the barren land, but around his beautiful wife, Rebekah. Her beauty, though a gift, filled Isaac with dread. What if the men of Gerar noticed her, desired her, and plotted to kill him to take her? He had heard the stories of his father, Abraham, who had once faced a similar danger. As the sun set over the Philistine city, Isaac made a fateful decision. He would do as his father had done before him to protect himself. He would hide the truth. "She is my sister," he told those who inquired about Rebekah. The words came out as smooth as the lies Abraham had once spoken in the same land. In a moment of fear, Isaac chose deception, hoping it would shield him from harm. He concealed the true nature of his relationship with Rebekah, masking his marriage behind the falsehood of siblinghood. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Life in Gerar went on as usual. Isaac went about his work, keeping a careful distance between himself and Rebekah in public. It seemed, for a time, that the lie had worked. No one suspected a thing. But the truth,
as it always does, found a way to reveal itself. One day, King Abimelech, from the windows of his palace, saw something that caught his eye. Down below, in a private moment, Isaac and Rebekah were together. It was a brief glance, but enough for the king to recognize something unusual in the way Isaac was touching Rebekah, something no brother would do. Abimelech's sharp eyes missed nothing. With growing suspicion, he summoned Isaac to the palace. When Isaac entered the king's chambers, his heart pounded in his chest. Abimelech wasted no time. "She is your wife," the king declared, his voice filled with both anger and disbelief. "How could you say she is your sister? What if one of my men had taken her as his wife? You would have brought guilt upon us all." Isaac's face flushed with shame as he stood before the king. His deception had been exposed, and now he had to explain himself. He confessed his fear, admitting that he had thought the men of Gerar would kill him to take Rebekah because of her beauty. But Abimelech was not impressed. Isaac had put the entire city in jeopardy with his lie, risking a great sin to fall upon the land. Yet in that moment of rebuke, something unexpected happened. Instead of seeking revenge or punishment, Abimelech extended protection to Isaac and Rebekah. He issued a decree commanding all the people of Gerar, "Whoever harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Isaac left the king's presence, the weight of his earlier fear now lifted. Though his deception had been revealed, God's hand had still provided protection through the most unlikely of sources, the very king he had feared. From that day on, Isaac and Rebekah lived under the shelter of Abimelech's command, safe from harm in a foreign land.
As the sun beat down over the dry land of Gerar, and the famine still lingered, but Isaac, against all odds, tilled the soil and planted his crops. As he stood at the edge of his fields, he knew he was taking a risk. There was no rain, no fertile earth to promise a great harvest. Yet Isaac had something greater than perfect conditions. He had God's blessing. And in that moment, his faith was rewarded. As the months passed, Isaac watched in amazement as his crops began to flourish. Each seed he had sown in the dry ground seemed to defy nature itself, bursting forth with life and abundance. By the end of the year, Isaac reaped 100-fold, a staggering harvest that could only be attributed to God's hand. It was a miracle, a divine favor that set him apart from all the others in the land. But as his fields overflowed with crops, so did his wealth. He gained not only food, but also vast flocks and herds. His household grew larger, and his influence expanded. The once foreign man in Gerar had become one of the most prosperous figures in the land. Isaac's wealth was now undeniable, his prosperity a shining beacon of God's faithfulness. Yet, with great success comes great envy. The Philistines, who had watched Isaac's rise, began to murmur among themselves. How could this man, a foreigner, flourish while they struggled? The more Isaac prospered, the more their resentment grew. Jealousy festered in their hearts, and soon it turned to action. In an effort to undermine Isaac, the Philistines began sabotaging the very wells that Abraham, Isaac's father, had dug years before. These wells were vital. Water was life in the arid land of Gerar, and by filling them with dirt, the Philistines hoped to disrupt Isaac's success. Isaac, ever patient, faced the opposition with grace. But the situation continued to escalate. His power, wealth, and growing household became a point of concern even for King Abimelech. The king could no longer ignore Isaac's influence, which had grown too large for his comfort. One day, Abimelech summoned Isaac to his court. His words were blunt, but his tone was laced with the unease that came with facing a man who had clearly been blessed by a force far greater than any earthly king. "You have become too powerful for us," Abimelech said. The implication was clear. Isaac's presence was a threat, not because of his actions, but because of his undeniable prosperity. Abimelech, fearing that Isaac's power might tip the balance in Gerar, asked him to leave. Isaac, though reluctant to leave the land where God had blessed him so richly, chose not to fight. He gathered his family, his wealth, and his livestock, and prepared to depart. But as he left, Isaac knew one thing for certain: no matter where he went, God's blessing would go with him.
Tension between Isaac and the people of Gerar was palpable. After Abimelech's request for him to leave, Isaac gathered his household and moved once again, this time deeper into the valley of Gerar, away from the prying eyes of those who had grown envious of his wealth and success. The valley was quiet, secluded, and far enough to avoid conflict, at least so Isaac thought. As Isaac and his servants set up camp in this new land, memories of his father Abraham flooded his mind. He remembered how Abraham had roamed these very lands, how he had dug wells to provide life-giving water in the dry and thirsty ground. But since Abraham's passing, the Philistines had done everything they could to erase his legacy, even going so far as to fill the wells with earth, burying both the water and the memory of Abraham's presence. Isaac, determined to honor his father and claim what was rightfully his, began the arduous task of reopening the wells that Abraham had dug. As the dirt was removed and the wells were restored, Isaac named them as his father had once done. The names were not just labels. They were symbols of Abraham's faithfulness and God's provision. But no sooner had the wells begun to flow again than conflict arose. Isaac's servants discovered a new well, fresh with water, but the local herders of Gerar, always watchful, came forward to stake their claim. "The water is ours," more they demanded. It was a bold statement, but one meant to intimidate. Isaac, ever patient, named the well Esek, meaning contention, for the water had sparked strife between them. Undeterred, Isaac and his men moved on, seeking peace. They dug another well, hoping this time to avoid dispute. But again the herders appeared, quarreling over the rights to the water. Once more Isaac named the well, this time calling it Sitnah, meaning opposition, for the struggles persisted. It seemed that no matter where Isaac went, conflict followed. But Isaac was not one to be discouraged. He moved yet again, this time further away, and ordered his servants to dig another well. As the days passed and the well began to flow, something remarkable happened. No one came to challenge them. There was no quarrel, no contention. For the first time in what felt like ages, Isaac found peace. With relief in his heart, Isaac named the well Rehoboth, which means room. He lifted his eyes toward heaven and declared, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in this land." It was a moment of victory, not just over the physical challenges of finding water, but over the struggles Isaac had faced with the people of Gerar. God had made space for him, space to grow, to prosper, and to continue his father's legacy. After the long and trying journey through the valley of Gerar, Isaac made his way to Beersheba. This was not just any place, but a land rich with the echoes of his father's faith. It was here years ago that Abraham had called upon the name of the Lord, establishing a deep connection with the God who had promised him countless descendants and land as far as the eye could see. Now Isaac stood in the very same spot, walking in his father's footsteps but facing his own uncertainties. As night fell over Beersheba, the quiet desert air carried with it an air of expectancy. Isaac, weary from the struggles with the Philistines and the many disputes over the wells, needed reassurance. The road had not been easy, and though God had blessed him, Isaac longed for the certainty of his presence. And then, as darkness settled, the Lord appeared to Isaac, just as he had done before. The voice of God pierced the night, filled with the weight of divine promise. "I am the God of your father Abraham," the Lord declared, reminding Isaac of the covenant he had established with his father, the covenant that would span generations. "Do not be afraid, for I am with you." The simple yet profound promise of God's presence was enough to dispel any lingering fears Isaac carried in his heart. But God's words did not end there. As Isaac listened, the Lord reaffirmed the blessing that had once been given to Abraham. "I will bless you and increase your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham," God said. linking Isaac's future to the faithfulness of his father. It was a powerful reminder that Isaac's journey was not just about his own life, but about the greater plan God had set in motion through Abraham. Isaac was not just living for himself. He was carrying forward the promise that would shape the history of his people. With God's words still echoing in his heart, Isaac responded in the only way he knew how, through worship. At Beersheba, Isaac built an altar, just as Abraham had done, and he called on the name of the Lord. This act of worship wasn't just a ritual, it was a declaration of Isaac's faith in the God who had been with his father and who would now be with him. As the altar stood tall, Isaac's servants began the familiar work of digging yet another well. This time there were no Philistines, no disputes, and no opposition. Isaac's presence in Beersheba was marked by peace, and the well was a symbol of the continued blessing of God's provision. The sun had barely risen over Beersheba when a surprising sight appeared on the horizon. Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, was approaching Isaac's camp, but he was not alone. By his side were his trusted advisor, Ahuzath, and Phicol, the commander of his army. The very men who had once driven Isaac away now walked toward him with a different purpose. Isaac, still mindful of the tensions and conflicts of the past, watched as the men arrived. He remembered how Abimelech had asked him to leave Gerar, feeling threatened by his growing wealth and power. Skepticism clouded Isaac's thoughts as he stepped forward to meet the visitors. "Why have you come to me?" Isaac asked, his voice tinged with caution. "Since you were hostile to me and sent me away?" Abimelech stood before Isaac, a man no longer filled with fear or envy, but with humility. "We see clearly that the Lord is with you," Abimelech confessed. It was a striking admission from a king who had once seen Isaac as a threat. Now Abimelech's eyes were open to the truth. Isaac was blessed, and it was clear that his prosperity was the work of God. "We want to make a treaty with you," Abimelech continued, his tone earnest, "that you will do us no harm, just as we have not harmed you." Isaac could hardly believe the transformation in Abimelech's approach. The very people who had once driven him away now sought peace. They recognized the hand of God in his life and wanted to ensure that no conflict would arise between them. It was not just an apology, it was a plea for lasting peace, a covenant built on mutual respect and the acknowledgement of God's blessing. Isaac, ever the man of peace, agreed to their request. But this time, instead of merely shaking hands and sending them on their way, Isaac did something more meaningful. He prepared a great feast. As the food and drink were served, Isaac and his visitors shared a meal together. The tension of the past seemed to melt away in the warmth of fellowship. They ate, they drank, and they solidified their agreement, not with papers and signatures, but with the breaking of bread. The next morning, as the cool air of the desert began to warm, Isaac and Abimelech swore an oath of peace. There were no hidden motives, no lingering fears, only the sincere desire for harmony between them. With the oath made, Abimelech and his men departed from Beersheba, leaving Isaac with a sense of closure and peace. But that day was not over. As the sun climbed higher, Isaac's servants approached him with news that was as welcome as the covenant just made. "We have found water," they exclaimed, joy lighting their faces. It was another sign of God's favor. Isaac, remembering the events of the day, named the well Sheba, which means oath. It was a fitting name, for the well was a symbol of the peace and promise made that day. And so the town that grew around the well became known as Beersheba, meaning well of the oath. It stood as a lasting reminder of the day Isaac, through God's blessing, turned opposition into peace. In conclusion, Isaac's journey through Genesis 26 is a story of perseverance, faith, and divine favor. From the trials of famine and opposition to the peace forged with Abimelech, Isaac's life reflects God's unchanging promises and the power of trusting him even in the midst of conflict. The covenant Isaac reaffirmed with God and the peace he established with Abimelech illustrate how faith can turn adversity into blessing. As we reflect on Isaac's story, let it remind us of God's faithfulness in our own lives. When we trust him, even in challenging times, he opens doors of blessing and peace.